What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The SMU Mustangs are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what SMU did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for SMU. My projection for this team was actually a little bit lower compared to my prediction because I didn't really know how much SMU was going to do in the Power 4 once they got into the ACC and everything. But my projection for them was 6-6, but then my prediction for them was 9-3. So once it came down, to the summer and everything, I was very high on this SMU team. Did not expect them, though, to go 11-1. This team going 11-1 in the regular season, going undefeated in conference play as well, making it to the conference championship. They lost the conference championship to Clemson, but they also lost that first-round playoff game against Penn State. So if you count those two losses, this team went 11-3 overall last year in 2024. This was the schedule from last season for SMU, and I think the big reason why SMU went 11-1 last year in 2024 was because of this schedule. It was a really easy schedule, in my opinion, for the Mustangs. First off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They played on the road at Nevada. That was a Week 0 game. Kind of was tough for SMU, but, pretty much after that game, SMU kind of, was really a good team the rest of the way. They also played HCU, a FCS team, but then they played a couple of Big 12 teams in the non-conference, BYU and TCU. They lost to BYU. That was a really tough loss there for SMU. BYU, though, ended up being a surprise team for the rest of the year. They didn't make the college football playoff and also the conference championship, but that was a pretty tough loss there. Again, if they would have beaten BYU, this team was not really that far away from being undefeated last year. But they beat TCU at least. They won 3 out of their 4 non-conference games, and then they went undefeated in conference play. You look at who they played at home last year in the ACC. They played Florida State, Pittsburgh, Boston College, and Cal. Not a very tough home schedule. We thought Florida State was going to be very tough, but that game was not even close. Florida State, the worst team in the ACC last year, which was honestly a big surprise. Pittsburgh and Cal and Boston College were pretty average teams last year. And then you look at their road schedule. They played on the road at Louisville, at Stanford, at Duke, and then at Virginia. They played 3 straight road games in the month of October. They didn't have a single home game in the month of October, but the Louisville game I feel like was probably the biggest win, and then Duke obviously was a big surprise team from last year. So that was a schedule from last year. Let's now take a look at 2025. This is the schedule for SMU coming up for 2025. And before we go game by game, let's take a look at who SMU plays in the non-conference for this season. So this is their non-conference schedule. They're going to be playing East Texas A&M, which is honestly an FCS team, and then they got Baylor out of the Big 12 at Missouri State. So they will play an FCS team in Missouri State on the road, which really honestly is kind of weird to be honest, but they'll play them on the road. And then you got TCU again, but this time it will be on the road. So the non-conference schedule, when you got Baylor and TCU out of the Big 12, it makes the non-conference schedule a little bit tough, but these are 2 winnable games. I think SMU will have a pretty good shot to win both of these games. The TCU game on the road will be extremely tough, but yeah, not a tough non-conference schedule. Pretty similar to last year. 2 easy opponents, and then you got a couple of Big 12 teams in Baylor and TCU on the road. So that's your non-conference schedule. Let's now move on to the home ACC schedule for SMU. They'll play 4 home games in the conference this year. They'll play Syracuse, Stanford, Miami, and Louisville. So not a bad home schedule for SMU. Syracuse was a pretty good team from last year. SMU probably will be favored against them. Stanford, obviously, like the second to last worst team in the ACC. And then you got Miami and Louisville, 2 pretty talented teams here. Louisville doesn't have a talent team like, Miami does, but, Louisville obviously is a team that recruits a lot of players in the transfer portal. And that'll be a rematch from last year. This time it will be at home for SMU. And Miami is a team that SMU did not play at all last year in the regular season. So really excited to see that matchup for the first time in ACC play. So that's your home schedule. Let's now move on to the away schedule here for SMU. They'll play 4 road games in the conference. They'll play on the road at Clemson, on the road at Wake Forest, Boston College, and California. So this road schedule is a little bit tricky. You got a couple of trap games with Boston College and Cal. Boston College always could be a trap game in the ACC, and then you got California. Having to go out west here, of course, that's obviously a main concern, but Clemson, that is the toughest road game here on this schedule. That is a rematch from last year's conference championship. And if you look back at this game, SMU is really close to getting blown out. If they would have gotten blown out, they probably would have been out of the playoff, but they almost nearly came back on this Clemson team. But this rematch, of course, will be taking place in Death Valley, one of the toughest places to play in the ACC. So that's your road schedule. Not a bad road schedule here for SMU. Pretty winnable games, in my opinion. That Clemson game will be tough, but the rest of the games here on the road are definitely winnable games for SMU. Let's now go back to the schedule here and go full game by game now for the Mustangs. They'll start things off with East Texas A&M on August 30th, and then they play Baylor out of the Big 12 at home on September the 6th. Then they go on the road to play Missouri State on September 13th, and then it's on the road at TCU, another one of those teams out of the Big 12 on September 20th. So you got back-to-back non-conference road games, which won't be really tough at all. And then they get a bye week here before playing Syracuse at home on October the 4th. So their last bye week comes in the last weekend of the month of September, and then after that it's Stanford at home on October the 11th. And then there's that road game against Clemson on October 18th. That's going to be a very tough game. And then they play on the road at Wake Forest on October 25th. So you got back-to-back road games there with Clemson and Wake Forest. Not very tough, but yeah, you got Clemson first, and then you got Wake Forest the next week. That could be a little bit tricky, but it's not really tough in my opinion. After that, they'll play Miami at home on November 1st, and then it's on the road at Boston College on November 8th. Their second bye week, the second bye week comes right before playing Louisville at home on November 22nd. That'll be a home game there for SMU. And then they close things out on the road at California on November 29th. So this schedule, it's not pretty similar to last year. I mean, you got a couple of non-conference games in Baylor and TCU out of the Big 12, which will be very tough, but their home schedule is not too bad. Miami and Louisville are pretty winnable games, and then you got Syracuse and Stanford. Stanford will probably be their easiest home game, and then you look at the road schedule. Clemson, that'll be very tough, but you got Boston College, Cal, and Wake Forest, potentially trap games, but those are definitely winnable games in my opinion. So that's the schedule for 2025. Let's now go into the projection here for SMU. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection. If it's a 1% game in the red, that's counted, of course, as an automatic loss in that percentage. 20% games in the orange, those are games where SMU will be a couple of touchdowns of underdogs by 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. Your 40% games in the yellow, those are games where SMU will be a clear underdog in by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that particular range. Your 50-50 games, of course, will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. Your 60% games in the purple, those are games where SMU will be favored by about a touchdown, just like the yellow games, by 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then your 80% games in the blue, those are games where SMU will be favored by a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points. And then your 99% games here in the green, which I already got a couple of them down, but those are your automatic wins here for this projection. So the green games, we count them as wins. I got two of them, East Texas A&M and at Missouri State. So these are two games where SMU should be big favorites in. I get it, Missouri State is on the road. It should be probably closer to 90%, but let's be honest. These are two FCS teams. SMU definitely should be able to take care of business in both of them. They're not guaranteed wins, but we count them as automatic wins here in this projection. So these definitely are two games that are at least over 95% in my opinion. So that's your green games. Let's now move on to the blue games where I think SMU will be favored by a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. I only got one on here, and that's Stanford on October the 11th at home for SMU. Stanford was close to being the worst team in the ACC last year, but Florida State kind of beat them to it. That, of course, will be at home here for SMU and everything. So yeah, that's a game that SMU probably should be favored by a couple of touchdowns. And we also count the blue games as wins. They're not guaranteed wins, just like the green games either, but we count them as wins as well, just because they're double-digit favorites. So SMU, that's the only game I can really see them being favored here by double digits, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range by a couple of touchdowns. Now we move on to the purple games, where I think SMU will be favored by 6, 7, 8 points, also known as a touchdown. I got 3 of them on here, and they're all on the road. Wake Forest, Boston College, and Cal. I talked about these games being trap games. I think they're definitely trap games here for SMU. Wake Forest, don't know how good they're going to be, but because it's on the road, that's the reason why it's in the purple. Boston College and Cal, 2 teams that were pretty average from last year, but SMU probably is the better team as of right now, but these might be 50-50 games once we get into those predictions here in the month of May and everything. So I think SMU will be favored in all these games by 6 or 7, 8 points. Again, by about a touchdown, somewhere in that particular range. They all won't be easy games on the road, but I think they're definitely winnable here for SMU, and I still think they'll be favored just because of how these teams finished from last year. And then that leaves you with Baylor, TCU, Syracuse, Clemson, Miami, and Louisville. These are all games that are 50-50 games in my opinion. They can definitely go either way. You can make an argument that Syracuse probably should be in the purple. Same thing probably for Baylor. But I got to tell you, I think Baylor is going to be pretty good this year. And then TCU, that's on the road. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. Clemson, because it's on the road, I get it. SMU probably should be an underdog there in that game because Clemson beat SMU last year in the conference championship. But I'm going to stick with it and put it in the 50-50 range. And then Miami and Louisville, those are 2 games that are at home for SMU. So it definitely gives them a shot here to not just pull off an upset, but also definitely make it a 50-50 game. So all 6 of these games are 50-50 games that really can go either way here for the Mustangs. So what does the projected record come out to be just based off of how tough this schedule is? Again, we count the green games as wins, and then you count that one blue game as a win as well. Then you average out these 3 purple games at 60%. Same thing for the 50-50 games. You average them out at 50%. And then you split these 50-50 games. Let's say you got 6 total 50-50 games. Let's say they win 3 out of the 6 50-50 games. You beat Baylor, TCU, or Syracuse, and then you lose to Clemson, Miami, and Louisville. That's going to give you a projection of 9-3. So that is what the projection comes out to be here for SMU. Again, if you split those 50-50 games, let's say they win 3 out of the 6. Let's say they do the opposite. They beat Clemson, Miami, and Louisville, and then lose to Syracuse, TCU, and Baylor. That's still going to give you 3 losses. And then you've got your green wins and then your blue win there. They'll probably be favored in those purple games, and then you'll have 3 more wins in those 50-50 games. That's going to give you 9 wins. You can make an argument that their projections should be 8-4. I totally agree with that, but just based off of where the teams were from last year, their projection comes out to be 9-3 just based off of how tough this schedule is. Again, I think worst case scenario, probably 8-4, 10-2, probably the best case scenario, but I'm going to go with 9-3 just for right now. So the same record as last year, my prediction, but definitely not close to my projection from last year. Do you guys agree or disagree for SMU? Give me your thoughts about this SMU team. What do you think their projection will be for 2025? And also, give me your thoughts about SMU's schedule down in the comments below. Is it tough or not so tough? Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.